So welcome, and welcome in from the rain. We have a proper London day today. Nice rain and a little wind. So this is the 6th of 8 lectures of the series Recognizing Islam and Muslims in Europe and North America. My name is Jonas Otterbeck. I'm a professor at Aga Khan University, Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilisations. And this far, these lectures have discussed the space-making and political participation of Muslim immigrants to Denmark, the growth of the US-based 5%ers and their key ideas, the changes in the field of European Islamic studies over decades, the creativity and industry of modest fashion, especially Muslim modest fashion. And a month ago, we learned about the establishing of local mosque organizations, acquiring local colors over time. The lecture series, Recognizing Islam in Europe and North America, emphasizes that researchers need to acknowledge and illuminate the actual ongoing, highly diverse production of Islam, and this with great detail and theoretical and methodological clarity. By assuming less and engaging more, much is won. Not least, we arrive at less clarity, less homogeneity, less self-assured, simple overall descriptions of Muslims and Muslim culture in singular definite tense. Instead, the goal is to historicize, contextualize, and analyze the complexities that surround the diversity of Islam and the diverse experience of being Muslim, or even those of being non-Muslim in relation to the diversity of Islam, Muslim lives, symbols, and narratives. Once wanting to see the reaction of an audience of scholars that had previously, during a conference, talked about progressive thinking in Islam in Berlin, I got the opportunity to take the stage and complacently suggest that progressive thinkers are generally lagging behind the youth with a Muslim family background living in Europe, who through their praxis are already way ahead of the progressive thinkers. I had Tariq Ramadan sitting straight in front of me, smiling, recognizing the provocation. Others stared, yet others looked a bit troubled. When you read Professor Bano's research, in which she, among other things, argues that in order for beliefs to persist, they must have everyday relevance, I feel I'm in good company of someone who has actually researched what I simply snugly claimed. This evening, we have the pleasure to have Professor Masooda Bano with us, and she will address the topic Indigenous Islam, Changing Dynamics of Islamic Authority in the West. I had to check now that you haven't changed the topics. You hadn't, thank you. Masooda Bano is a Professor of Development Studies at the Oxford Department of International Development, University of Oxford. Professor Bano carries out comparative fieldwork across Muslim societies and builds large-scale studies combining ethnographic and survey data. She's currently directing a 5-year major research project called Changing Structures of Islamic Authority and Consequences for Social Change, a transnational review. And you have a new book there. And
you are welcome to see, or I'll mention
and it'll end up in our library eventually. She's also the author of several well-known books like Female Islamic Education Movements, The Redemocratization of Islamic Knowledge from 2017, and The Rational Believer, Choices and Decisions in Madrasas of Pakistan from 2012. Further, she has edited several works, among them Women, Leadership and Mosques, Changes in Contemporary Islamic Authority from 2012, Modern Islamic Authority and Social Change, which is a 2-volume book on Edinburgh University Press that came out 2018. And it's in connection to this work, not least the 2 later volumes, but also this that you have here with you, the topic that we chose for this talk has been sort of formulated. So the first thing that we're going to do is that we're going to sit and have a little chat. And then we'll start the lecture. So I'm curious about
this large project. You're quite a few researchers involved in that, as I understand it.
Yes, it's like, you know, European Research Council, one of the main grants is the fund. Yeah. So that project, to be honest, the work lasted for 6 years, and it's almost towards the end now. And a lot of work that I'm presenting today, or even the book I'm leaving with you, which has just come out 2 weeks ago with Cambridge, is all work done under that project. And it basically, the European Research Council, big grants are very good for having postdocs. So it's not that too many senior researchers were involved. There was a good advisory committee, but I had a number of postdocs running. So the 2 volumes of by EUP have work from, you know, Nathan and who were quite good.
But it's been not only Europe, it's been sort of all over the globe.
All over. So the EUP 2 volumes are, first one is about Islamic Authority, the changes in Muslim majority countries. So in that one, we look quite a bit at Al-Azhar, the parent institution, the Urban tradition in South Asia, and the Arab in Turkey, and finally Salafism. So for that, even I was carrying out a lot of primary fieldwork in those countries, while they were doing a lot of textual analysis or scholars writing in those locations. While volume 2, what I'm presenting here is volume 2, which is looking at the West, trends in the West.
And one of the things I'm curious about, also when I read the volume 2, it's the one about Europe.
Exactly.
Yeah, or Europe, North America.
Exactly. And that's much thinner volume. Volume 1 is huge. It's a
quite a bit. But I'm curious about what, I mean, it's the oldest discussion in sociology of religion authority.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your new take on it in that sense?
Actually, you must remember that this work, it's not per se that I'm contributing to sociology of religion, because I'm not a sociologist. Yeah, so the contributions that the 2 volumes are making, one is more directly to Islamic study and conceptualization of authority within Islamic study field. That's what I'll be presenting today.
So it's bringing in some models also in Islamic studies.
Islamic studies, and also like the way the traditional Islamic studies literature, like the work on Islamic studies, looks at Islamic authority, what constitutes Islamic authority. Is it just the knowledge of the text, or is it like, you know, the moral authority you build by living by it? So, you know, those kind of concerns comes in. That's the those are the contributions from the volume. But my own monographs are much more, they don't, to be honest, talk about authority that much. It's more about this particular book, which is on revival of Islamic rationalism. It's very much about, it's framed within more of an Islamic, not Islamic, theoretical literature, a bit more from political science and a bit from economics, where you look a lot at the incentive structures and how knowledge formation in a given context is very shaped. Any kind of knowledge is very much shaped by the socio-political context in which you frame it. So, do you understand? The theory moves quite different. It's not sociology or religion per se, hardly so, in fact. So, it's either Islamic authority kind of literature, which you'll hear today, or if you read the book, you'll read the other part, which is more about how social, political, economic incentives directly inform the kind of Islam you see today as opposed to yesterday, or if you see in one location as opposed to another.
Well, you certainly have the attention of sociologists of knowledge of religion, at least. I mean, I know that you're invited as a keynote speaker to the Nordic Society of the Sociology of Religion, for example. So, without further ado, please.
So how do I move it one way or the other, just to be sure it works this way?
Yeah.
Let's try. No. Oh, no. Sorry, what am I doing? You're doing this? Yes. So like I said, it's nice to be here. So can you what? Is working on. So like I said today, the work I'm presenting today is directly drawing on 2 volumes. In fact, sorry, just give me a minute. I'll also show the one. There's much bigger volume, which is volume 1. But these are the volumes that came out with Edinburgh University Press 1.5 years ago. And they were one of the main outputs from the big project we were just discussing, which was funded by European Research Council. And this work is very much framed within the Islamic authority literature, coming from, like I said, not from necessarily from sociology or religion, but how Islamic authority is conceptualized within the literature on Islam. So, and the concern in that one is that why study Islamic authority to begin with? It's a very established field. So why are we interested in the subject of Islamic authority? when we're studying Muslim societies. And in that one, the main concern remains that Islamic authority is quite a central theme in Western scholarship on Muslim societies, because the argument being that religion being a powerful force in Muslim societies or Muslim communities in the West makes those who speak in the name of Islam very important figures. So it's the authority these individuals exercise, classically ulama, but even other platforms, which I'll mention in a little while, which have the power to influence people's decisions, everyday actions, that makes them important. So that makes Islamic authority a very important theme within literature, Western literature on Muslim societies. So let's look at how the literature looks at authority, the debate on Islamic authority. So first of all, authority in general, we have to understand, is a relational term. So it depends on voluntary adherence. You don't force people to, you cannot force people to follow you. There's it's not like power. Authority and power are different things. So authority has to have a willing compliance. People should be willing to follow you. Therefore, like a scholar can claim to be a scholar, but they cannot claim to be an authority unless we can establish, at least as researchers, that's what we'll argue, that they have a significant number of following, people who are they are being able to influence. And another sort of concern that we have then is, so that's about, yes, the following is important, but what has traditionally been considered, what are the attributes of authority, let's say, when we look at Islamic context, Islamic scholarly context. And of course, traditionally, the argument is, and which I would endorse too, that what we find too, that knowledge of the text, of the primary text, remains key to establishing Islamic authority. You can have different kind of Islamic authority platforms. Of late, there's a lot of work on even like young TV preachers emerging who can develop a lot of following and all. But in terms of who really constitutes sort of a following which really influences people's decisions, historically, we have known, and our work in contemporary time shows too, that the knowledge of the text, starting with the Quran itself and the primary text, remains the key form of establishing Islamic authority. But equally, your moral standing is very important. So the argument that you live by what you teach remains very important to establishing your Islamic authority. And this particular argument goes back to the life of the Prophet itself, the argument being that that if you are a scholar and a preacher, then just like the Prophet lived by the example, the scholar should live by too. So it is required of the scholar to do that, not that all scholars would necessarily be living by that moral standard. And thirdly, what I'll argue is that if you look at historically, another important point, which is important for the argument I'm going to make later, so this point is important, a fact that we don't normally recognize, which is important to Islamic authority, is that historically it was very important that the scholar also relates to the context. So do you understand? So the argument that yes, they should have the very solid knowledge of the primary text of sources, they can quote from them, they establish their knowledge, they try to live by certain moral behavior, but also that they can show that they're providing solutions to the answer that the society needs. So whether it's the Umayyad period or the Abbasid period, or all the sort of empires in Islam and all, there was always a role for the scholars in the state to provide answers to things, to ensure that whether it's in the commerce, whether it's in other societal dimensions, the things that are being done broadly are within the confines of Islam. But of course, there was a lot of adaptability even in that period. So the scholar had that ability to adapt to the needs of the time, and that's what I'll argue partly went missing in the colonial period, but now we are seeing a revival of that in the scholarship in the West. But anyway, so to retain this point from this argument, what I'm making is that the relevance to the local context historically was important. The scholar should be able to give answers which are reasonable for the time. That expectation historically was there. And then before I move to the next slide, just to broadly touch on it, there are different types of course, authorities, and traditionally in the Muslim world today, the most important one remains the ulama. The textual authority remains most important in terms of what it means to live by Islam, or what it really means to live as a believing Muslim. But having said it, Sufi tariqas, for those who adhere to Sufi tariqas, they become important too. But in our work, we are more interested in the ulama-based authority, scholarly authority. Textual Authority. And then, of course, Islamist can be the political Islamist, Muslim Brotherhood and all are another, or Jamaat Islami are another form of Islamic, they claim to be Islamic Authority too, although that is a bit more contentious, often more specific to the followers of the movement. And of late, recently, as I said, online TV-based imams are also coming up. But out of all of these, in general, what we still see is that the ulama writing a lot in the traditional Islamic platform like Al-Azhar or Deoband from those platforms remain the most influential. It hasn't gone forward. Understanding Islamic Authority, no. What am I doing? 1 minute. Yes. Oh, something else is happening. Can you need to tell me what's happening, because I won't otherwise be able to keep forwarding. How do we forward? Which one do you want me to press? Sorry. Okay, fine. Sorry. I will put it in the forward one. So what I'm covering today, like I said, we did a lot of work on the Islamic Authority platforms in the major ones, the four I mentioned in the introduction: Al-Azhar, Deoband, Diyanat, like the Turkish tradition, which is reviving and becoming quite globally influential in certain circles, and Saudi Salafism. So the first volume deals a lot on that, and even there, the argument is that we are seeing a lot of adaptability to need for changing times. And I must step back here for a moment and to explain why did I initiate this project? Why ask this question about Islamic Authority and how scholars are adapting to the need of the time. What happened was that before I started this project or even conceptualized the idea of it, I was doing a lot of work with across Muslim countries. Historically, I've done that. For my previous book on female Islamic Authority, these female Islamic movements that were coming up. And across the Muslim world, whether I was in Jakarta or Cairo or Islamabad, wherever, you were seeing that the sensibilities of the youth are changing. So it's a very globalized sensibility, and a lot of liberal, people want social space. The living sort of styles are changing. And the most recent example of that is now Saudi Arabia, the way it's opening up, the youth wanting, the cinema, forms of entertainment, socialization, the cafes, that lifestyle that normally is seen most associated with Western liberal social norms. So I was seeing that, but at the same time, I was seeing that the loyalty to Islam is not disappearing. It's not that, people are becoming socially liberal. So I'm seeing that, they are saying, Islam or religion is not important for me when I was in those contexts. So that's what made me think that, okay, fine, if that's the case, then through our work on religion in general and Islam, we all know that Islamic, like all kind of religious authority, adapts to time. Religious authority is also pragmatic. So if you don't adapt, you lose followers. So there's always a bit of adaptability. The struggle is how to stay loyal to the core while adapting. That's the struggle. So you want to be loyal to your core while saying, okay, fine, solutions are possible to adapt to your contemporary time. So with that thing in mind, the argument was, let's look at what scholars in the Muslim majority countries are saying to these very contemporary issues about whether you attend cinema halls or gender-wise, is co-education allowed, or those kind of questions, gender, environment, economics, interest, whether you take interest or not. So all those questions we were looking at. So the idea was to look in the Muslim majority countries as well as what scholars are doing in the West. And like I say, what we're covering here is more from what I found, we found as a team, as scholars are doing in the West. So to go back to what I was telling you before, how we conceptualize authority. What we have to historically also understand before I move to the contemporary is this, that the argument I'm making here is that based on scholarship available, there's enough to argue that what happens in the colonial period to Islamic scholarly platform has a lot of implication in understanding what the kind of Islam you ended up seeing even in the Muslim majority countries in the last 2.5 or 3 centuries, but also what got transplanted in the West, in the Western communities. So if you look at UK as an example, or otherwise, even if you look at the European or American context, what we know very well is that it's the same institutions that were dominant in the home country that came with them here. So if South Asian Islam, which is dominant in UK, is very Deobandi or Brelvi, because those institutions came here. But what we have to remember in that one is that these institutions that themselves often were created in the colonial period and were much more retrograde in terms of how they associated with reality around them. So Deoband, the very dominant institution here, the South Asian institution here, which comes up in late 1800s in India, was a direct reaction to the colonial rule because the Muslim political power was declining. Muslims were insecure because before Deoband, I must mention, Frangé Mahal, the dominant madrasa tradition, was very rationalist. It was very much from the Persian strand of Islam. So very different engagement with text and with mantiq and philosophy and all of those texts. But in the colonial period, when the Western education institutions start replacing madrasas, like there's a lot of that history which I won't cover today, but just imagine that madrasas are completely marginalized from a context where they were the mainstream institutions and produced all the scholarship and were funded by the state, and now they were really relying on community donations. And so the nature of scholarship being produced in that context dramatically changed, and it was a very reactionary scholarship, which was more about protecting your Islam because you're too scared. If you engage with the reality outside, you'll just lose the core. So it becomes very pietistic Islam. Do your rituals, do your prayer, become very intricate about those details while disengaging with what you can do for the state or society in terms of modern reality. Because even society is not coming to you for modern answers anymore. Neither is the state. They have changed dramatically. They are in European hands now. So we have to bear in that this the argument I'm making that historically the scholar had the pressure, the traditional scholar had the pressure, the four madhabs, classical madhabs we had, Hanfi whether it's Hanfi, Shafi, or Hanbali, or the fourth one, then Maliki. The scholar had this sense that you have to relate to reality and give practical answers. That one disappears in most of the movements in the colonial period through Islamic, most of movements that become influential in that period, and they become very pietistic. And it's that same kind of Islam that comes then to the West. Do you understand my point? That's the kind of link I'm trying to build, because that's important in my argument to tell you why I feel this current shift is important. The kind of scholars I'm identifying today are an important development. Let's move forward. So today I'll focus now on telling you this, that based on our work, what we have done and what we have found is happening to Islamic Authority in the West. And I'm very the volume is very optimistic. It's very promising about the future of Islamic scholarship, especially in the West. And one of the bigger arguments one is making is that West is no longer a recipient of Islamic scholarship from the South. I mean, of course, Deoband and all are still very influential. They will. There are good 12, 15 major Darul Ulooms in UK, so they won't disappear so easily. The influence will stay, but even the graduates are adapting. That's what I'll try to highlight, in order to relate to the reality today. One is not saying all of them are adapting, but quite a major share of them are trying to adapt to modern reality. But basically, rather than just being a recipient of Islam and these imported imams, that's the history, till very recent past, till last 10, 15 years, all your imams in the mosque, whether it's UK, US, or Europe, are coming from, simply imported from a village or a city somewhere, and often from quite marginalized sections of the society. So, when they come here, they can't speak the language. That's a very standard concern. Even in my interviews, it keeps coming up. The young Muslims here would say that he can't even speak English to me properly. So, how do I respect him? How do I engage with him? Why go to the khutbah if I can't follow it? Those kind of arguments. So language itself is an issue, but also the complete lack of social knowledge of social reality around you makes these scholars very, one can't even call a lot of them scholars because they're just mosque imams, who come from these other countries. So they might not be very highly educated anyway in Islamic studies. So they fail to give you practical answers, and then a lot of youth leave the mosque. So, as opposed to that reality, the current reality is that Islam in the West, the kind of institutions that are emerging now, the ones I'll discuss with you today, are actually the type which are now capable of exporting scholarship to Muslim majority countries, to the liberal-minded, to the more educated Muslims, the ones I was telling you that I meet in, say, Islamabad or Jakarta or Cairo, like who want to be loyal to Islam, but in a very progressive, liberal kind. Not like progressive Muslims, don't mix them up. I avoid that word normally because there's a group called progressive Muslim, that's a very different group. But do you understand socially liberal sense? They want to be a socially liberal, but they be loyal to the Islam. So some of these scholars now have influenced that way as well. So a major shift is happening, which I'm saying is a major shift. That rather than just importing, you're now in a position to actually export to the Muslim majority country, especially the educated liberal classes. And that's the argument actually is very central to the book itself, the monograph I'm leaving with you. because I believe elites and knowledge creation has a very special dynamic. Basically, colonial period, you lost the Muslim elites from the Islamic production process, knowledge production process. And now with these scholars coming back, you're bringing the Muslim elites back in serious study of Islam. But that's a developed argument I conceptually developed the most in the book. Not in these volumes, because these are less theoretical in a social science sense. They are more Islamic study volumes, the ones I'm presenting today. So looking at these institutions, why am I saying that they are promising? So I'm giving you, this is my categorization. I chose to conceptualize them this way. What we found were, I had these postdocs, we had this grant and 2.5 years for this work, because in the second half we did other kind of work, like why Muslims choose across these different ones. You know, some are going to one type, some the other. That's a different part of the project that I'm not presenting today. But when we started looking at what's happening, you know, so there are, find these traditional Islamic institutions, but who else, are there any sort of new platforms emerging? And of course, you start finding a lot of them. A lot of the institutions are coming up in the West, and when we started mapping them, the most influential ones where, you know, you saw that a lot of people are like young Muslims, you can see in their membership, or they're turning up for their events or their speeches. Three categorization, I argue, become useful and analytically helpful. So first group we call is the neo-traditionalist. This is the group that the monograph is about. But I in fact contend that neo-traditionalist is not the best term for them, because first of all, everybody wants to be claimed, even the Hanbalis claim traditionally they are the traditionalist, because that's claims that asserts a certain authority, or you know, you're the most legitimate one. So of course they want to be claimed, they want to be called traditionalists, but I think to understand their contribution and to understand why young Muslims are following them, my argument is they are better seen as Islamic rationalists, because they're doing a lot of sort of reviving a lot of scholars which are associated with Islamic sort of deep mystical or philosophical texts, Ashuri, Maturidi, Kalam, and all, a lot into Al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, all of that. So that's the neo-traditionalists, but here I'm calling them neo-traditionalists because normally they like to be called traditionalists, and here I was not complicating enough in the book I do. And the most two prominent sort of institutions in that framework are Zaytuna College, which is, I don't know how complicated it will get if I start trying to click one or two of the sites. Do you think it's worth it, or I should leave it? Zaytuna College, if you want to click on it, is it possible for you to do that? I mean, just to like people get a bit of sense if they haven't ever seen their website or anything. So Zaytuna College is the most sophisticated of them all. It's the Islamic Liberal Arts College, first Islamic Liberal Arts College in the UK. In some way, to put it very simply for some of the followers, it's a very cool place. Do you understand? It's like a lot about humanities in Islam. It's all about Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Arabi, all of them you can find there. And the kind of people who are going there are, you know, very much into. So one of the things is revival of Islamic horticulture. They keep having workshops on that, and you'll see girls, you know, dressed in very nice, you know, traditional dresses, but you know, very sort of, it's all quite hip and cool in some way. But having said it, in the book I argue there's a lot of depth to their work, because one part of the scholarship then gets like looks at them and say, oh, you know, dismisses them as these cool scholars and that's all they are. But I show you in the book that no, their work is having much deeper impact, because it's the ability to inspire the young Muslim, especially the Harvard graduate and the Oxford graduate, to engage seriously with some of these Islamic texts, and then to reproduce or try to become an imam on the side while becoming, say, a medical student of, again, I mean, I've interviewed a lot of those profiles, and this is something I find most promising. Can we go back? So that they're bringing back this particular group I find particularly interesting, because they're bringing back some of these what you'll call Muslim elites going to the best of institutions to see a study of Islam. The other one, and this one is Cambridge Muslim College. People might know that one a bit more because that's right in Cambridge with Tim Winter, Abdul Hakim Murad. Both of these are converts. No, I think we have gone too quickly. We need to go back. Did we go too quickly? Yes, so let's stay on this one because I need to explain these different types. So this one is Cambridge Muslim College, and this Tim Winter, Abdul, how many of you would know Sheikh? Well, I would expect some, might have expected even more to know him. But anyway, so remember, Zaytuna College is led by Hamza Yusuf, who's a white convert, and there's dynamics to it. Those things matter, even among the followers. The fact that, you know, a white upper middle class American who was all into philosophy and all of that, very sort of can establish his depth when he talks. Studied in best of institutions in the West. Same for Tim Winter, comes from an elite British background, converts to Islam, but is a graduate of Cambridge himself. So, in the young Muslim, that kind of thing really sells as well, that they are convinced of our tradition, so let's engage with them. And then you engage with them and you see the intellectual depth of this tradition and you get really hooked onto it. So personally, I find this tradition the most promising, and that's what the book is. That's why it became my book, bigger book length project. But to conceptually explain to you what they do, I don't know how many of you are Islamic study background, but basically they are reviving what you say, the importance of the madhabs, like the 4 legal schools of law, that must be revived because they're very much against the Salafi or this direct engagement with the Quran and interpretation. So core to their work is a revival of the 4 madhabs. You could follow any, they're very pluralistic about it, but you must follow the legal tradition as it historically evolved. And they are very much into Ashri, Maturidi, Kulam. That's where the more sort of rationalist kind of logical but deep mystical tradition comes in their work. And as a result, they're very much about living by practice. So Hamza Yusuf, Tim Winter, when they have their gatherings, the idea is to act as a moral guide. It's not like you are just like a teacher and you give a lecture. It's not like Tariq Ramadan. You give a lecture and you go away. It's like it's gatherings. They go for retreats. I've attended a lot of those retreats with them as well. And then they'll sit with you late night. You'll have like seated sessions, all of that. So a lot of moral companionship comes from that, by example. So they are the neo-traditionalists, so much more into a bit of Sufi, definitely strong mystical strand, but they don't like to be called Sufis, neither would I call them Sufis, because that labels them. They look at it more as deeper mystical side of Islam, without having to go into tariqas. Hamza Yusuf, in fact, is a bit wary of tariqas for the control the sheikh can get as a result of it. So that's a neo-traditionalist. Neo-legalist, the second category we develop is the one where a lot of institutions are coming up, which are very much about, as we were also discussing, about Maqasid Sharia very explicitly. This whole idea that, just to mention, neo-traditionalists don't talk about reform of Islam. They say Islam always had all this sort of intellectual sort of depth, all of that. It's just revival. Again, the colonial period, marginalized Muslims, this and that, Islamic knowledge. We are just reviving the old tradition. Neo-legalists, on the other hand, talk about reform. That Islam, Islamic law is outdated. These madhabs won't answer the questions. Their methods are limited. Tariq Ramadan is the most visible figure. Kyle, the first institution I mentioned, is led by him, funded a lot by Qatar, and it's based between Oxford and Qatar. IIT is a much older institution out of Washington, D.C., but both of them are very much into Maqasid Sharia. So we say you move away from the narrow interpretation of the law to go for the principles of the law, like which are 6 core ones, and because that gives you much more liberty to adapt to your local environment, and they do quite a bit of work on that. And then neo-conservative is the name I gave to the third category, because this was a slightly different one. This is the ones that they are products of institutions like Deoband, or Salafism, like these traditional institutions that we are discussing. They're graduates of those institutions, and they are now coming forward and saying that they're respecting the tradition, but they're saying that you need to adapt. So Yasir Qadi, I'll give you some examples of the kind of work they're doing. A US-based Salafi preacher initially, but now very adapted, has a degree of PhD now from Yale. So combines his sort of Salafi method, but with a much more progressive, like liberal understanding of how is it to live like a Muslim in the US in a realistic way, that you're not clashing with your secular society, but coexisting quite peacefully. Ibrahim College is another institution established by graduates of Deobandi institutions in the UK. So they're graduates of the very sort of orthodox Darul Ulooms, and based out of London. This one, Ibrahim College, on the other hand, is adapting much more. So to give you one example, the traditional Deoband Ibrahim College, one of the videos, if you follow the debate of one of the scholars there, he gives you an example like how his teacher, Deobandi teacher, who had been in UK for many years, part of the Deoband Madrasa, would say that he won't take part in democracy. He won't participate in election because democracy is un-Islamic. That kind of debate still exists. While this guy, then the younger one, is saying that that's a very unrealistic proposition. You need to take part in democracy. That's the best way to protect Muslim rights. You have a voice, all of that. So you must engage. And so even within the tradition institution, a lot of adaptation is happening. And finally, within Darul Qasim, this is again a Deoband-based inspiration institution, just like Ibrahim College, but based out of Chicago, and again very progressive in its, how you're relating to the reality. Also quite open in terms of willing to teach all 4 madhabs, as opposed to the original Deoband, which only does Hanfi tradition. So so a lot of adaptation is happening. There's a lot of detail on each one of them, which one could anybody, either a bit is covered in the volume 1, otherwise the other ways to learn more as well. So out of all these institutions, what types? So I'll give you a brief sense of, so these are the different institutional platforms, but what kind of methodological tools? I mean, this part is really for more Islamic studies scholars, if they're interested. So what are the Islamic legal concepts or terms they're using to adapt? Because like I say, for all of them, whether you're in the West or the Muslim majority country, the scholar, that the tension is the same, which when I was once interviewing Tariq Ramadan, he was saying the same thing, that the classic tension for all of us remains that how do you adapt but ensure that the core doesn't change, that tension, adaptability and retaining your core, because if you keep changing, then you could be nothing in the end. So, what do you do? How do you retain that legitimacy of the core and adapt? So what we find is that across the Muslim world institutions that we covered, which is much more bigger volume, like I keep saying, just because there are more scholars, more scholarship there happening, 3 concepts are coming up a lot, and they're coming up repeatedly when it comes to adapting to local reality. One is fiqh al-waqi. And this is a lot linked with Qaradawi has produced a lot of work on it. And these scholars in the West keep going back to fiqh al-waqi, but they're not in the position to do deep text themselves. What they do is they cross-reference either Qaradawi or Bin Baya, because these 2 big scholars in the Muslim world are writing quite a bit on fiqh al-waqi concept. And the fiqh al-waqi concept, like I said, it goes back to the early Muslim societies, and it says that Islam has always been about, fiqh has always been about relating to your reality, the need of the time, and we lost that ability, especially in the colonial kind of context, and we need to go back to that. So using that argument, they allow for a lot of adaptability because times have changed. The argument constantly goes like this: look at the situation, this is the question, but the times have changed. So if travel was, say, for a woman wasn't allowed in the early period, it was safety what was the primary concern, safety. So now if planes are safe, she can go without a mahram. Those kind of reasoning are happening. Similarly, the second concept being used a lot is fiqh al-aqliyat. This is minority fiqh. And this is being very applied in the Western context. This is the one where Qaradawi has written a lot. And some people say it's been stretched a bit too far, but that's the kind of work that is forcing. A classic example of this one is a fiqh al-aqliyat kind of work is the mortgage question. Muslims living in the West saying, can we have should we take mortgage or not? A classical, very strict answer would be no. You shouldn't engage in trust-based transactions. But Qaradawi and many others say that in the minority context, if that's the best way to protect, the only way to protect, ensure that your family gets a house, and and there's no insecurity in the long term. They give certain reasoning and textual references to say that's legitimate. So do you understand the critics of these approaches would say, oh, they're just like using them to allow more or less everything, while those who follow them and been like especially Qaradawi is quite influential, like seen as a moderate and quite influential in the moderate kind of Muslims, is that no, there are some limits, of course, they maintain. So then there's a bit of legitimacy is there while adaptability is happening, that kind of thing. And third concept that keeps coming up, like I said, is Maqasid Sharia. So this one again is like the other two is saying, okay, you can step back. You don't need to be, confined by very sort of narrow legal traditions. So forget about what the madhab say, that like the Hanafi scholar said about, because some of these madhab, the scholarship within that could be very precise about do this or that in this context, like on a Friday Jummah prayer, how to perform certain thing, if the congregation is big or small. So they are saying that, step back from those kind of minor details and just look at the principles of Sharia and then relate it to the reality kind of thing. But all three are like very sort of rich works on their own right, and volume 1 gives you quite a bit of sense if you're interested. Because Poya, in my team, I was doing the political economy analysis. Like I say, my work is more on saying how the politics and the economy and all of that is shaping the evolution of these institutions, even in contemporary times. In volume 1, I do that more systematically for Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and what's the fourth? And Egypt. Like how your context shapes the kind of scholarship these scholars end up producing. But my team was Islamic studies and Islamic and intellectual history. So they do those chapters, which give you a lot of detail on this, on these concepts. So I'll invite you to look at that. So in some way, the bottom line, one of my main argument and for this research then is that what you're finding is so that's where a bit of sociological theory finally comes in, which is this, but that's a concept even in economics, that there's this concept in knowledge creation and all, that there are different forms of knowledge. One knowledge is one that is a textual knowledge. You learn something by, by studying it. That's normally what we think of knowledge. But there's another form of knowledge which is called Michael Polanyi in, I think you'll think of him as Polanyi would be a sociologist, right? So he uses the idea of tested knowledge, and then within economics also quite a few scholars in different way have used that similar kind of idea, which is this, that our knowledge is not shaped by what we formally study in a book and all. A lot of it is unabsorbed, like it happens all the time by living in the reality we live in. So, so our knowledge is never just like what you read, but it's the lived knowledge of the everyday reality around you, which subconsciously shapes how you think, how you address issues, how you analyze anything. And there's quite a bit of work on tacit knowledge. So my argument is that what is happening with these scholars is the ones who are, whether it's Tim Winter, Hamza Yusuf, or Yasir Qadhi, is that they are being able to bring the tacit knowledge of the reality around them. The problem is that when you bring a scholar from Pakistan and all, however much liberal or progressive they might be, first of all, a lot of them are not, because these are just simple mosque imams who come. They don't even have the full training as an Islamic scholar, the ones who end up staffing mosque here. But even if they did, the problem is that if you're grown up in a very different reality, even if you say, okay, fine, I'm a bit more liberal, I see youth here have, drinking places, this and that, I have to sort of understand the context. There's an inherent limit to it, because that was never your reality. You don't know, what it's like to be a young Muslim in West, living everyday life. So these scholars, because of having been born and raised in the West, all of them, whether they're converts or Yasir Qadhi kind of profiles, who are or the ones leading Ibrahim College, they know the tacit knowledge of reality along with the text. So the ability to combine the two is what's producing this knowledge, which is much more relatable to the reality than would be possible otherwise. And that's the same thing, that historically the argument is that the scholar had that tacit knowledge of the reality. Scholars were part of the, whether you look at the Ottomans, whether you look at the Umayyads, fine, there were also always some scholars who moved out, deliberately stayed away from the state, because they wanted to stay independent. But most of your scholarship was coming from scholars who are very elite. They were parts of the elite. They had a sense of what it is like to lead a society. So that reality is very different than the reality of a scholar in the colonial period who's very marginalized. So, and the fact that in the West now, some of the best families, children, and that should determine by the institutions that are going to the top Western universities, they are coming back to study overseas Islamic texts with some of these scholars, whether it's with Tariq Ramadan or Tim Winter, Hamza Yusuf, I find very promising for the future of Islamic scholarship. And like I said, that I give you in the book as well examples in the last chapter in that book, how there's evidence that these scholars are now having influence in Muslim majority countries too. For example, in the retreats I've attended in Spain and all with some of these scholars, or Berkeley, you often find a lot of Muslims from Muslim majority countries participating, either because they're students in that place, or they knew through friends and they were visiting and they end up joining. So, and these scholars then go to these countries to increasingly represent. So I think more or less, you want me to go until 7 and then have half an hour for discussions, right? So because I can for another 5-6 minutes go on, but my main arguments are out now. Do you understand what I mainly wanted to raise? So I think now what I like to address is that what are the factors propelling this change? Why? Again, a bit more of a sociology kind of question. That fine, if this is happening and the scholars are changing, what's propelling it? And like I said, I've given you already an idea that globalization of attitudes is there, all of that. You see, especially social liberalization, where I've been doing a lot of work in Saudi Arabia in the last 4 years. And the shifts that are coming there is the best example of how, what is happening is the TV network, is the social apps, Twitter, and all these apps keep coming up repeatedly. Even in the remote part of Saudi Arabia, the girls I visit, they'll always tell you, and they'll have the latest mobile in their hand, and they'll mention 4 or 5 apps. I'm not very good with apps, so it always takes me time to remind myself of them. But there's this Twitter, Snapchat. Think of all these ones, where you share photographs, you can follow, like people will tell you, I can follow life of women in the way in New York through these apps. So I know what it's like to, to live those kind of lives. And then travel. This is coming up a lot, the ability to travel a bit. And even in Saudi Arabia, it's a lot of this thing that, okay, fine, Saudi Arabia might not have that many options, but we go to Kuwait, forget about US and all, but the neighboring countries give you enough option, whether it's Dubai, it's Kuwait, all of that. So sensibilities are changing globally. And that's one of the arguments that's propelling it. But also what is propelling is in the second generation is that there is definitely evidence of a bit of economic and educational mobility among the second generation. So of course, there's still a lot of challenges, but many more are making it to better universities, becoming part of those sort of higher educational institutions. And within that crowd, there's much more desire then to integrate in the mainstream as well. So that way, in terms of policy, the message is very clear. The more the Western societies allow opportunities for especially integration in higher education, and the better chances of people wanting, Muslims generally wanting to integrate. So that's there. And And one thing to remember also about the dynamics in the West is another one, which is this, that which I'm not presenting here today, the work, but the second part of the project, because we have done work with young Muslims in Oxford and Dewsbury, one mixed Muslim context, Dewsbury very dominantly Muslim, and then Germany two contexts too, to see how young Muslims are, and over there the Turkish Muslims are most population here in Germany. Here they are South Asian Muslims. And the thing is that there's much more choice here. So it's more likely that in Pakistan, in Cairo, you'll still end up going to a neighborhood mosque, which is Al-Azhari, or, you know, set in a certain tradition. Pakistan, most probably you'll end up with a Deoband one or a Barelvi one. Choices are pretty set, or a Jamaat Islami one. Choices are pretty set. In the West now, what's happening is that a lot of in the same neighborhood, you can have, go back to Oxford, our example, and it's just Cowley, one neighborhood, which is literally 2 long streets. That's where the Muslim concentration is, and there are 5 different mosques available, and they range from one Deobandi, one Barelvi, one part of the Islamic Center, which is much so-called more intellectual, because that's part of the university. So the imam there seem to be a bit more intellectual. That's how people define them to you. And one a bit more on Bangladeshi side. So 4 or 5 options in that one neighborhood. So young Muslims can choose more. And there's a bit more evidence that in the younger group, the cross-ethnic, you know, you're not just going to your ethnic mosque, but the desire to go across is increasing. This kind of opportunity is still not there that much in the Muslim majority countries. So here, the choice, that's why we ended up doing more work in the West on this one, how young Muslims then choose between scholars or the mosques that are available. And one point I'd also like to then make, given I have 5 minutes, is this one, that there's, see, I have today given you examples of all the approaches that, let's call them, they're bottom up. So second generation is coming up, third generation is coming up, and they are saying that the reality of the traditional imam is not answering our question. They can't even speak to us in English properly. We don't understand the sermons they give in Urdu or Bangladeshi. So, you know, we are not much interested. So as a response, like we're saying, second and third generation Muslims or convert scholars have come up who are saying, we need to, you know, they're part of this sort of dynamic, and they say, no, so we need to adjust, and we, young Muslims are looking for answers, and we'll step forward and give them. But having said it, that's one approach. The other one is top down. So on the other hand, so this is like community-led, like people from within the community are taking initiatives, Muslim community. The other one is the state has, since especially September 11, after that, across Europe, UK, tried to put a lot of reforms from the top, you know. So the idea to modernize Islam is very much there, and it has taken shape of, in France, like courses run by state on for imam training. Netherlands, Germany, Germany both have tried theology, establishing Islamic theology departments, which they did not have before, because they didn't have Islamic theology, they had theology. Then Netherlands ended up having to close, if I know both of them, or at least one of them, because eventually what happened was that those who will come to these theology departments, because they were meant to secularize the Muslim education, could build no credibility within the Muslims themselves. This is something we see even in Bangladesh and Muslim majority countries. If the state tries to produce these secular kind of Islamic scholars, the idea is that they have no authority within the public, so you don't shift the Islamic discourse. People still go to the traditional scholar. So what you really, my argument would be, what you really need, whether in the Muslim majority country or the West, is institution like CMC or Zaituna College, where a genuine new discourse emerges, which is more rationalist, more philosophical, more mystical, while relating to practical reality, but has authenticity. The state-led efforts have failed systematically on that. So even so, Netherlands one, so there's evidence those theology department didn't work, but the Germany one, recent one, I'm more involved with them. I mean, the sense of research happening on them. Same evidence is coming out that they're failing. The graduates of those universities are not in a position to take leadership positions in the mosque or Islamic community. So then the state purpose is failed in that way. You cannot shift the discourse because you have no legitimacy in the graduates you have produced, and a lot of them, to be honest, are not even interested in those who come to these theology departments are not necessarily even aspiring to become, you know, scholars. They might come for very different incentives. One of them is rural urban, kind of like from smaller towns, you might be able to come to a bigger German university because of that. And then I think I can just finish with that, with one comment on another theme I work a lot on, but that's not the subject today, is that women and Islamic Authority, because one of the big shifts of the last 30, 40 years is, starting 1970s, is this, that there are more and more women Islamic groups coming up. So at one level, the concern for the liberals would be that there are more women wanting to, you know, in this modern time, why are more Muslim women wanting to go and study Islam, textual Islam, more seriously? You know, after all, because these movements are from the followers of these movements are very much about if Islam allows half inheritance, they'll accept that. It's not like, oh, they are challenging them or whatever. So for the very liberal mind, that's a concern. But of course, I would argue the issue is much more complicated. But that's the book, The Female Islamic Education Movements. But in general, the other part of that story is that as a result of that, on the authority part of the story, is this one that as a result of that, in the mosque and madrasas now, it's the first time they are like good. Mosque is good, it comes in the times of the Prophet, so it's a good 14th century old institution. Madrasa easily another 10th century, because officially madrasa supposedly start at the data we have, the evidence we have officially is more like 10th century. So they're that old institution, but the female part of it only starts in the last 30, 40 years. It's 1970s that across Muslim world we are finding mosque and madrasas increasingly opening up spaces for women because of demand for this kind of Islamic knowledge. So as a result, on the Islamic Authority side, more female preachers are coming up. And the argument is the liberal side would hope that some of them will challenge the traditional interpretation of Islam around gender, again, whether it's half the inheritance or men having right to have 4 wives or this and that. But so far, at least we are not seeing that, because a lot of them are extensions of wives or daughters of the male scholars who end up leading those institutions, and the followers are happy with that type. They're coming, they are elite women as well, but they're coming because they want the traditional Islam. They're not the Islamic sort of feminist, which could be another strand, but I don't see too much of that in but these Islamic movements are spreading quite a bit. So I think I'll finish with that. I've covered quite a bit. And for this one, you don't order, but I put the flyer out just for, if you're interested in the book, it will give you a sense of what the book is about, on the Hamza Yusuf and
Could you say something about the new book and hold it up?
Yes, I would love to do that. So this is what one is more passionate about as an author. The volumes are fine; they are your team volumes, and you do, and they have a lot of contribution to. But it's the books that, and if they come out with a good publisher, that make you really happy with what you've been doing. So this one, the Revival of Islamic Rationalism, is it draws on a lot of work that I did under the project. I'm entirely into this project with this network, which is Hamza Yusuf, Tim Winter, Umar Farooq Abdullah, and then a second generation. So these are they're all white converts to begin with. Then the second generation, which becomes, I don't think some of you know, Seeker Hub in Canada, quite influential in the American young networks, and Talib Collective. So quite interesting institutions which are doing very sort of interesting, deeper philosophical, mystical kind of debates in Islam, while taking the law very seriously. So that's the part about that. They're not moving into just soft Islam, but very strong on the legal side too. So this book is about them, that network, and my main argument is that it's a very positive force because not just of the scholars, but the third generation that I trace for you in this book is the mainstream young Muslim. So it's the young Syrian Muslim, young Pakistani Muslim that I've interviewed in Canada or UK, who has been taught by the scholars now, but is now, is in the top Western university, is pursuing whatever the Western scholarship he wants to pursue, but privately is very deeply engaging with Islamic texts, the earlier Islamic texts, which have been lost in the madrasas of today and all, whether they are from Al-Ghazali, Rushd, or more legal scholar from the different classical madhabs. So this book is very much about it. It has 3 parts. I'll just briefly mention. So I give you the introduction to this network of scholars, why they emerged, the sociology of it and all. But a good solid chapter on what is Islamic rationalism. Can I label that Islamic rationalist? And because traditionally, Islamic rationalism in the Western scholarship, and that's the thing I'm trying to complicate, gets too easily equated to Mu'tazilaites, which is a very sort of narrow, in my view, conception of rationalism in Islam, because they were supposedly pushed out, and then people say there was no rationalism in Islam. But I think there was a much more deeper tradition linked to Al-Ghazali, and I take that as Islamic rationalism, which comes with deep mysticism. So there's logic, there's philosophy, but deep mysticism is part of it. And I think this is what the scholars are reviving, and that's the appeal to the young Muslims. So the last part is very much based on the fieldwork with the young Muslims in the retreats and all, who come to it not because these people are Sufis or whatever. No, there are many other Sufi networks. They come because of these deeper texts, this deeper intellectual sort of revival of the tradition. So I'm happy about it.
So please.
So hello.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your very thoughtful report. My question is kind of twofold. What I'd like to ask is, how do these overlapping authoritative structures, sometimes in the case of especially Barelvi system. How do they really negotiate their authority, given the fact that their discourses differ from each other? For example, Sufi madrasas run by ulemas. So how do they? How are they able to function? How do they negotiate over the production of knowledge or the dissemination of Islamic discourse?
Okay.
And the second part would be if they don't, are they able to merge somehow? And what kind of Islam is being produced as a result of them being merged together?
No. Do you want me to keep answering or what? So, no, I prefer that if possible to keep addressing. See, there's not much evidence at all of engagement between the Deobandis and the Barelvis. They stay pretty isolated in the debates. But historically, Islam has a very strong tradition and encouragement for the process of Rad or Munazara, especially in the South Asian context, where the argument was that the scholars of the different traditions must come together, on one platform physically, and the students would be there too, and discuss arguments. So that process is called process of Rad. You argue without fighting in a logical, intellectual way. Rad meaning, Rad actually is very much based on reason, that you argue with each other, just like scholars do, say in any scholarly tradition. But to be honest, neither does that much happen in South Asia today, because that's a progressive way of engaging. You are differences, you'll always remain different, but you recognize there can be overlaps, or if there are differences, you need to understand those differences intellectually. That process doesn't happen much now, and even if it happens, it doesn't go very far from an Asra kind of concept. And in the UK, I don't know of any. I mean, the Bandi or Bravely platforms is genuinely, really engaging. I don't know of any. In fact, I've been one last comment, and then one as part of the second part of the project, which I could not cover today at all. We have been doing some of the interviews with the graduates of CMC, Cambridge Muslim College, the network in winter, because they have one program which is very influential, is that they take graduates of Darul Ulooms, whether Bravely or Deobandi, and give them 1 year course to expose them to the Western reality. And when you do interviews with those graduates, it's very clear that the Deobandi madrasa and the Barelvi madrasa is not telling them to talk to each other at all. So I don't have any evidence of that engagement.
Within Barelvi, for example, when the authority between Sufis and the ulemas overlaps, and that kind of knowledge being produced, or have they really merged together? Because their discourses differ, but ulemas function in the sense of they support Sufis, but they do not disseminate their knowledge. So
see, Barelvism is not my specialist area, and neither do we cover it into the field work, what's happening in the Barelvi madrasas here. But the distinction you're drawing is actually more complex. Fine, I get your point that the Barelvis anyway are seen more into the Sufi part of things than the Deobandis. But having said it, the higher level Deobandi scholar, historically or traditionally, some of the big scholars were quite missed. The tasawwuf was important to them. So do you understand? Sufism, the tariqa system becomes different than the tasawwuf, which is even in Deoband a very powerful concept. But the problem becomes not tasawwuf to do it proper, because a deep text, you need some high level of education, which a lot of your ordinary madrasas don't. So I think it's the same tension in Barelvism too. You cannot say whether they emerged or not. Ideally, a good Barelvi scholar or a solid Deobandi scholar had both, they might call it Sufi or they might call it tasawwuf. There might be a difference on that, because Deobandis won't use the term Sufi at all. But tasawwuf was core to a lot of Deobandi scholars too. But I think it's the ability to engage with those deeper texts that varies, whether it's within Barelvi or Deobandi. That's my answer.
So I've got a long list already. Some of you are sort of signaling a second time. I've noted you. But first.
Thanks a lot for an insightful session. So 2 questions, very quick. So first of all, I was trying to figure out from the examples that you quoted for the new authorities coming up in the Western context, was there any Shia authoritative context that you've covered in the examples? Because I was like trying to figure out, and it was more like a very Sunni centered.
Sorry. So this project admits, and the volume admit upfront, that we give only to Sunni Islam, because we're doing so many contexts that for me to legitimize and do Shia debate as well, I just thought as a scholar I might lose credibility on that, so we don't touch Shia Islam.
Because Shia Islam is more like very centralized, like in Iranian and Iraqi context.
So the project doesn't touch Shia Islam at all, and we acknowledge that in the volume, that it's just Sunni Islam.
The other thing is that you've said that the authority is evolving in the Western context, and now more and more indigenous people are coming up. Is there any way, like in the coming decades, like 3 or 4 decades, we can see some institution as strong as like Darul Uloom Deoband, like in the Western context, like having so much authority in this context, like a Darul Uloom Deoband of the Western context? Can we see that authority coming up in like 2 or 3 decades? Like
I think 2 and 3 decades, I'm very positive about Zaytuna and CMC both tremendous institution in the UK, the kind of people which are, because I'm basing them not on the scholars themselves alone, but the young Muslims or the students they have who themselves are becoming teachers. And I find both of these institutions very promising. Give them another 20, because they're those solid kind of graduates they're producing, young Muslims, Syrian born, whatever here, who then goes back to the Muslim world, spends good time there to master the Arabic, so those foundations have been built solidly, and then they come back. They'll all need 20 to 30 years to consolidate, because right now for language they have to go there, but they're hoping in future they can do those kind of courses here too. So I'm very positive about them, but remember that it's also the following, that it will appeal a lot to the liberal minded. But to communities, when I say it's promising, second generation has more opportunities. It's a certain class. Your Dewsbury kind of communities are still quite close. So over there, the following of the traditional ones might continue for longer. So this book is very much about the knowledge. It matches the social, political, especially the social and economic context. So this liberal one is appealing to those who are doing well. In fact, the last chapter is about Islam of the elite Muslims, because you have to be certain socio-economic class to really relate to, to want these kind of things, because that's what your reality requires. So I think these institutions are coming up, but depending on your attitude, you might have different ones.
Muhammad Amin, in comparing intellectual development in what we call the West and Muslim majority countries, how much weight do you think should be given to the fact that in liberal democracies you have virtually complete freedom of thought, speech, writing, etc., whereas almost all Muslim majority countries have severe limitations on freedom of speech, especially what you can say about religion, for example?
Actually, that's very interesting. In some way, it's the liberal sort of progressive values of the West in terms of speech. It's particularly not liberal values per se, because some of them could be problematic actually. But especially in the speech area, that makes all these institutions very it enhances their potential to do the scholarship even better. Hamza Yusuf, for example, a lot of Muslims in the critique US government for minority, like not treating Muslim well and all. And so he comes around now increasingly very aggressively saying that you must respect the US Constitution and the law. In fact, defends the right, that freedom of speech much better than a lot of contexts where you have come from. If the Muslims complain a lot about the US system, in fact, and then he's criticized for that too. That he's defending the US state or whatever. But there's logic to that. Do you understand that he's saying that there's much more freedom of speech in this part of the world for you to do the kind of scholarship and the reasoning that would be beneficial. And in fact, on that one of the Muslim, it's a good comparison, although you did it in a different way. But if any one of you has followed after CC took over, and all this killing of Muslim Brotherhood members and all of that, which are contentious even for human rights. And forget about what you think of Muslim Brotherhood, but women, children are killed, 800 of them in this Arab mosque operation. So a lot of the Al-Azhari scholars endorse the state, Bin Baya and even the Al-Azhar and one or two other scholars, prominent ones. So that's been a big issue for normal Muslims to say, how could you dislike killing of a Muslim, whatever type they were, but they were Muslims. And on that one, when I've ever discussed it with the scholars in the West, Tim Winter or especially Tim Winter, so they all say that you have to just keep in mind the context they're working in. The state is so oppressive, they have no choices. So that's why because I was asking them, why did not you condemn those scholars? Because their state being neutral about them. And the second, you have a bit of sympathy for the context in which they're working. The state just oppresses them.
Please.
My question is it working?
I hope so.
When we look at media, particularly the Muslim TV channels and social media, we really feel that it's all dominated by sectarian instincts. Huge negative waves are raging, and millions of people listen to them. And I wonder, these new institutions Are they heading towards a pluralistic Islam and in a larger context, pluralistic human society, so that Islam can become a factor for peace? Or are they still, confined to their sectarian past?
That's a very interesting point you raised. I haven't had a chance to, I forgot to bring that point up, but in the volumes themselves, this point is very clear, especially in the West one. The strength of all of them, even the ones which are coming are extension. I mean, other Muslim windows, you can imagine, are anyway liberal-minded, so they're all about pluralism, understanding, coexistence, all of that. But even, and the Ayatollah Madani, you can imagine too, but even Yasir Qadhi and Ibrahim College, those who are products of Salafi, traditional Salafi, Al-Madina University, or the traditional ones here, all the discourse, I didn't have time to cover. I gave you examples of the Islamic legal terms they're using, and all. But on the other side, on these scholar side, they're all using reasonable citizen, these kind of languages. What is it to be a reasonable citizen or responsible citizen? And that directly then translates for all these scholars into being into pluralism, that you have to respect differences within the tradition too, but also that you have to respect that you are in a minority context and you coexist by respect. If you don't respect the law for the other, they won't respect it for you. So it's all about pluralism and a lot of respect, mutual respect. And so on that front, very positive. Very positive.
There is hope.
There's hope. No, so my all very hopeful about the future of Islam.
Because the social media is giving a completely different image.
I think it's all about numbers actually, but I, for example, don't know. So I don't know where it will eventually go, but my view is that the start of the 20th century, or whatever century, and 21st century, was about jihad and all. By the mid-century, it would be, the movements which would be spreading fast would be these rationalist ones, because there's more appeal for them. Now, how much to change the core, the numbers are big, that's a different thing. But when you say that as a proportion, which movement will spread fast, I don't think the radicalization is now spreading fast. It's actually these kind of movements which are spreading fast. That's fine.
Please.
I have two questions. The first one is, you mentioned that your work is contributing to the Islamic studies and the socio-political understanding of the production of knowledge and not sociology. In what sense is not sociology? First question. Second one, my sense as someone who studied the network of progressive thinkers, I feel the scholarship is very much divided, whether critical of these as top-down scholars or pro them. And I wonder whether, especially with reference to what you mentioned about the elite thinkers, could we see these as what Randall Collins saw as different cliques of thinkers who are struggling within the same intellectual fields for legitimacy or authority? Thank you.
Yeah, so the first one is this, that I don't work with sociological theory at all. So this tacit knowledge idea, I quote Polanyi on that in the volume itself, which I think is more sociology, but I do a lot of work from institutional economic sense. So Douglas North and all have similar concept of knowledge which is beyond your the textual knowledge and all, and Frederick Hayek and all others have similar concepts too. So because I don't do, when you don't do a theory of some discipline, then I don't claim I do that discipline. You understand? Because it's more theory defined. So my theory comes more from institutional economics, which is strand of economics, which is not, as you can understand, it's not about economics, but it's using those incentive-based kind of system to understand how informal institutions work, like religion work. It's a very expanding field. So I work within that, or political science. I don't do sociological theory. That's the reason I don't claim any of that. For example, I'll never, very rare, I'll refer to write about Weber conception of authority, which would be a starting point for a lot of sociologists. I can engage with it, but it's not something I write about. And secondly, your second question, sorry, you misunderstood. I wasn't talking, I don't at all call them the elite things. What I'm saying is their followers are from the Muslim elites. And for me, that's very important, the way it's laid out in the book, for the elites to engage with production of knowledge, because that's the only way our knowledge thrives, a form of knowledge becomes influential in society. And then it draws investment, because elite and to produce, just like Oxford and Cambridge, you don't have the elites going there sponsoring it, you lose without the finances and status and all of that. And in the colonial period, that's the loss. The elites exited madrasa system. We have enough scholarship, Francis Robinson, all of them, historical relations, scholarship on that. So I'm not calling these scholars elites, but I'm saying Muslim elites in the West and Muslim majority countries are coming back to engagement of Islamic texts because of these scholars, and that's promising.
Thank you, Professor Masooda. I just have one question, because I had other questions that other people have asked already. So could you kindly tell us if you have worked on Shia Muslims as well? Your research has ever worked on Shia Muslims in Pakistan or here?
I've never done it, but I've co-authored a volume with a very dear friend of mine, Kiko Sakurai from Japan, and I've been to Iran with her. So I've visited a lot of these Mashhad and all these main sites, Shirans and all. We did a volume on globalizing Islamic discourses, which looked at three major Islamic universities, Al-Azhar, Al-Madina, and Al-Mustafa from Iran. So Kiko specializes in Shia Islam. So that volume I co-edited, so I went through the chapters 2 and all of that, and it covers Shia context as well. And like I say, I know Iran in the sense that I've been there and visited all these shrines, but I've never written about Shia Islam because I do so much comparative work. There comes a point where you start wondering if people will take you seriously if you keep going more and more comparative. So I've deliberately stopped myself from doing Shia Islam because I cover enough diversity within Sunni Islam itself. That's my strength. Like I go across the Sunni Islam, but not Shia.
Please.
Hi, my name is Anya Ibiari from SOAS. I recently finished my PhD about Islamic higher education institutions in the UK, and actually I did fieldwork in two of the institutions you mentioned, Ibrahim College and Cambridge Muslim College. I think we met actually during my fieldwork at Cambridge Muslim College.
Oh, I remember meeting one girl from SOAS, so maybe you've changed a bit, or it's been a while, but no, I remember the discussion. I couldn't place the base, but I remember the discussion. I'm sure you all have.
Yeah, and you mentioned that some of these kind of movements in Western Muslim circles are having an effect in Muslim majority countries. What evidence do you have for that?
Now, see, I tell you a lot about. If you look at the last chapter of the book, I give you examples of people who are going back and trying to lead initiatives where some of these discussions are take place further. Yeah, so, for example, the last chapter of the book opens with one of the girls from Brown's. From Brown University, who goes back to Lahore after attending Rela, and where she attends to Winter as well as Pardoon, as well as Amir Yusuf. All these people are teaching, and she gets very inspired by that and all. And she's into Sufi writing and all, but before that, very Western influence. So now she, after this sort of Rela participation and all, becomes much more into Rumi and the Islamic sort of thinkers and all of that. And then she starts holding poetry sessions in schools in Lahore, elite schools in Lahore, where these kind of sort of discourses or these kind of sort of Islamic poetic traditions won't necessarily be taught today or very actively taught today. So that's the argument that these ideas do trickle back, and slowly, those debates are evolving there too. Second evidence you have is that a lot of these scholars are invited now very regularly, whether it's Malaysia, Egypt, Dubai. They're holding regular, they're invited, they don't go themselves, they're invited and hosted. So that's another sign of their influence happening there. And then, like I said, on the retreats, a lot of them come. So you can only at this stage establish an influence in the sense of people actively taking part from them. And then also, like, for example, another one I can tell you is that we did a survey with Muslim youth in universities, Qaeda-Azam and Lams. And in that one, some of the scholars are mentioned. So there's a growing sort of recognition of the scholars in these places.
I'd like to ask about you. The sharing and developing knowledge in a sort of the social media basis is a global one. But each knowledge is produced in the local basis. They're shared. You said its context is very important. But this knowledge shared in internet or social media is produced in a different context. And can they actually understand each other? They do have some misunderstanding each other, and what's the sort of negative and positive side of that?
Sorry, I'm not sure of the question. So the question is that social media is produced in different contexts.
Yes.
Yes, but who are we comparing? Which two contexts?
So it's each one, the posted sort of the knowledge to internet or social media. This knowledge is produced locally in a different context. And people in the different locality, they may not understand the sort of the point well.
I get it. So no, I think, but you have to bear in mind, don't you think that people tag on or connect to those social media that we all choose? We are not following everything. We choose what might be the closest to us. So what I'm saying is that my own view on media and authority is Islamic authority as well, because it's a big debate, especially ever since internet came out and these online imams came up. The argument being that the traditional platforms are not very important anymore, you mosque and madrasa, because people are just going to following scholars they find on YouTube or whatever. But actually what you find is that social media has not been able to change too much of the nature of Islamic authority, because eventually you might go on YouTube, but people criteria for choosing scholar is the traditional one, which is that people will often follow, oh, they'll see where did he graduate from. Is he Al-Azhari? Is he Deobandi? You know, depending on whichever tradition they follow. So there are certain stamps of legitimacy that are required. But yes, the social space has changed. You don't have to physically go and visit the university. It can be online. But you understand, using social media does not changes the way people assess authority or choose their authority structure. So my answer to, do you understand, is a bit same for social media, that I think social media is important, but people are likely to choose those media channels that they naturally think closer to. Unlikely I'll subscribe to a media channel which, like, I don't doubt if you're very American oriented and you're thinking you'll subscribe to an Iranian TV channel, while I know friends in Oxford who are a bit critical of US policy, so they love to subscribe to Iranian TV channels. So do you understand? I think we choose a bit based on our interest and propensities already.
Thank you. I was wondering, because when you cited the theories or concepts that are very popular among these higher education centers, you mentioned three that are very much initiated not in non-Muslim majority context.
And even in the majority, but both.
No, they are initiated there, and most of the authors actually work there, which is actually sort of a source of criticism for those. So I was wondering if you had examples of other powerful theories or concepts that have been developed in these institutions, not that have been grafted by scholars. I mean,
do you understand? No,
like,
it's very interesting you're asking this. So see, one or two concepts to say masliyat, the concept of masliyat, keeps coming up quite a bit. So like the other concepts as well that keep coming up, but these are the most dominant one. But all of them, whether even a simple sort of idea of masliyat, is drawing mostly from scholars. The same one, the big ones, you know, in the Muslim majority world, whether it's Qardawi bin Baya and who's the other one? Can anybody remind me of the name of the Al-Azhari scholar who became very contentious because of his cooperating with the CC, but very influential? Who are we talking about? Juma. So exactly. So his work, these three are writing a lot in terms of deeper text. And that's the thing, that these scholars, when we look at Minter, Hamza Yusuf, they don't like to use the term at all shaykh for them. They're not shaykh, they don't ever claim that. I mean, people who call them shaykh is still fine, but for example, what are the higher terms, more legal ones, like we say mufti and all? Not at all, because they claim that we are not at all those kind of experts. So all of them, the ability so far is that they're picking up on deeper Islamic textual debates in the Muslim world with the big scholars and adapting it to this context. So that's their strength. They're not engaging at all in deeper texts themselves. I don't think they have the ability to do that. Maybe apart from Yasir Qadhi might be able to do that, because he's at least trained in the Medina kind of tradition. But even he doesn't claim to do that. It's more like he draws on work of other scholars and then adapts. Their strength is to adapt in an intellectually deep way, but their sources are very clear. That's still there, the Muslim majority one.
We have an interesting question here from someone who's following online, Nasheem Hussain. And I'll just simply read it here. Not just limited to Western scholars, but there seems to be a risk, particularly in Western influenced scholars, authorities, being influenced by Western concepts that are globally perceived as okay, like aggressive capitalism. Have you studied Muslim authorities who have been able to address modern reality to younger and older Muslims while not succumbing to being complicit in things like immoral versions of inequity and capitalism? Seems like this would be especially difficult while living within these systems.
Actually, that's a very clear answer to that. And again, this person should definitely have a look at the book, chapter, I think 4 or 5, where I tell you that what is the real life changes, you know, if you engage with their scholarship, what does it mean to live by that kind of Islam? The Hamza Yusuf and Tim Winter people are very, the Western commercialism is one of the biggest concerns for them. Consumerism and commercialism is one of the biggest concerns for them. At one level, if you look closely at them, they become more like environmental, you know, in terms of the living implications they have, it's more like very environmental conscious kind of campaigns, because too much excessive materialism is very bad. So simplify life, just go for more organic farming and all of that. So that bit is there, but otherwise commercialism capitalism, they're pretty critical of that. So having said that's this particular network, which is very much against consumerism, and they see that as one of the big problem of Western modernity. That's how they critique it, and that's why they feel, that there's a lot of problem with Western modernity. But having said it, some other scholars, can I say the same for Tariq Ramadan kind of network and all, how conscious they are? I think they're not just replicating. I think they're all critical minded. So I don't think that necessarily we can say they'll all be replicating the Western consumerism.
Can I just add then to Machine Hussein's question, and for example, say something about African American popular culture and scholarship, which tends to take a more post-colonial and decolonial perspective quite often, especially in rap. You can find people who challenge along the lines here, challenge capitalism, challenge white supremacy, challenge neoliberalism. Could you find that also among the scholars that you study?
I think what I would say that anti-capitalism, yes, I mean, but not in a very rhetorical sense. I think they're more nuanced than that. It's not like, bashing capitalism per se, but yes, like I say, excessive consumerism is seen to be one of the biggest problems of Western modernity. So very much against that. So in return, it's through that even against capitalism, like of the modern type. But the other, but I think that's where it stops for me. I don't think I see the other two, what you mentioned in the rap culture happening. But for sure, they find. So see, a lot of the defense of Islam comes from what they see as the limitation of Western style modernity, what Western modernity has done to human life, and consumerism, excessive materialism is the central concern there. You think that's the good point here?
That's a lovely finish, actually. And it's 7:30. Thank you very much for coming, and give Masooda Bano Thank you.